She strolls into court, thinking it's gonna be a typical day. But bam, out of nowhere, she gets hit with a $10,000 fine. No heads up. No warning. Just a judge slamming the gavel and acting like he's king of the world. But Pam Bondi ain't backing down. With all eyes on her, she flips the script, calling out the flaws in the system and putting that power-hungry judge on blast. Just when she thinks she's got him pinned, the system fires back, hard. This ain't just a legal fight. It's a high-stakes brawl where one wrong move could cost her everything. Will she outsmart the judges and flip the crooked ruling? Or is she about to be their next target? Keep your eyes on this, 'cause the way it ends, it's gonna flip the whole game. Chapter 1. The $10,000 Blindside. Pam Bondi pushed through the heavy doors of courtroom 3B, expecting just another routine hearing. Easy stuff where she'd check some boxes, drop a couple of lines, and be out before lunch. But the second she stepped inside, something hit her. The air was off. Too quiet. The usual courthouse buzz, the murmur of gossip, rustling papers, the occasional cough was dead. It was all silence. Thick. Waiting. She barely had time to settle into her seat before Judge Dalton's gavel cracked down. "Ms. Bondi," he said, his voice sharp like a blade. "You're being fined $10,000. Pam froze. "A fine? For what?" She snapped upright, forcing her face to stay neutral. "Your Honor, I'm gonna need you to explain what I'm being fined for." Dalton didn't even look up from his stack of papers. "Court doesn't entertain interruptions, Ms. Bondi." A murmur rippled through the room. Pam's jaw tightened. So this was his game. She took a slow breath. "With all due respect, Judge, I didn't interrupt anything. You just slammed me with a 10 grand fine without a word of explanation. I'm entitled to ask why, aren't I?" Dalton's eyes shot up cold as ice. "You think you're entitled?" The way he said it made the room feel like it was closing in. Pam didn't flinch. "Yeah, due process is a thing, Your Honor." A collective breath from the gallery. A challenge. Dalton's lips went thin. "This is my courtroom, Ms. Bondi. You don't get to tell me how to run it." Pam felt every single eye on her. She knew she was walking right into a trap. Knew she was supposed to back down. But that wasn't her game. She leaned in, hands on the table. "So let me get this straight. You're slapping me with a 10 grand fine. Right here. Right now, no explanation, no hearing, and no legal grounds? That what you're doing?" Dalton tilted his head, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "Yep." Pam exhaled, shaking her head. "And here I thought we still followed the Constitution around here." Silence. Heavy. Tense. The court stenographer froze. Dalton's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping. "Tread carefully, Ms. Bondi." Pam knew she was poking the bear. Knew he could throw her in contempt if he wanted to. But that wasn't the point. He was making an example of her. And she wasn't about to roll over. The more people saw this, the better. She turned her head, scanning the room. Jurors, clerks, spectators. Everyone was watching, waiting to see how she'd react. She squared her shoulders. "I'm challenging this fine." Dalton's smirk grew. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that it's straight up illegal." A sharp intake of breath from the back of the room. The whispers began to swell. Dalton's smirk faded. "Watch yourself." Pam crossed her arms. "Or what? You gonna slap me with another fine? Double it up, make it an even 20. Dalton's knuckles turned white against the bench. Bingo. He wasn't expecting her to hit back this hard this fast. He thought she'd take it, sit down, shut up like all the other lawyers he'd thrown around. But Pam Bondi wasn't like them. And this fight, it was just getting started. Chapter 2, the gloves come off. Pam could feel the heat building in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. This was a message. A warning. Sit down. Shut up. Play along. Screw that. She straightened up, her voice steady. "Your Honor, I'm formally challenging this fine on the grounds of due process violations." Dalton leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, that smug little grin back on his face. "And who exactly do you think you're talking to, Ms. Bondi?" Pam didn't flinch. "A judge who seems pretty comfortable ignoring the Constitution." A sharp intake of breath from the crowd. Even the bailiff looked up. Dalton's jaw twitched. Good. She was getting to him. His voice came out slow, calculated. "You're walking a fine line, counselor." Pam tilted her head, matching his cool tone. And you're getting dangerously close to judicial misconduct, Your Honor. The tension in the room was suffocating. The clerk stopped typing. The spectators froze. Everyone knew something big was going down, but no one dared to make a sound. Dalton's knuckles tapped against his bench, a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Finally he spoke. You want to challenge my ruling? Fine. State your argument. Pam could hear the silent dare in his words. Go ahead. Try me. So she did. She took a breath, turned slightly, and made sure everyone in the room was hanging on to her next words. The Supreme Court has ruled time and again that financial penalties imposed without due process violate the 5th and 14th Amendments. Dalton let out a short laugh, shaking his head. And where exactly are you going with this? Pam locked eyes with him. I'm saying your ruling is flat out illegal, and I've got case law to back it up. For a brief second, something flickered in his eyes. Annoyance? Uncertainty? She didn't back down. In Matthews versus Eldridge, the court ruled that due process requires an opportunity to be heard before penalties can be enforced. You just hit me with 10 grand out of nowhere. No hearing, no explanation. That's textbook violation. Dalton's smirk thinned. Ms. Bondi, this is my courtroom. I decide how things run here. Pam let the silence drag on. Then she let out a quiet, humorless chuckle. See, that's where you're wrong. The law decides. And you're just supposed to follow it. Boom. Dalton's nostrils flared, and for the first time, he actually looked rattled. He opened his mouth then stopped. Thinking. Calculating. Pam knew it then. He wasn't expecting this. He thought he could steamroll her, make an example out of her, and move on like nothing happened. But now he had a real problem. Dalton shifted in his seat, adjusting his robe like it had suddenly shrunk. Then with a clipped tone he waved a hand. Fine. You've made your point. Continue. Translation. You just made this a hell of a lot harder for me. Pam didn't smile. Not yet. This wasn't a victory, this was just round one. And if Dalton thought she was backing down now, he was in for a long day. Chapter 3. Cracking the judge's armor. Pam could feel the room shift. Dalton wasn't playing it cool anymore. No more smug smirk. No more leaning back like he was on a power trip. Now he was sitting up straight, jaw clenched, fingers tapping against the bench. She had him. Now it was time to press. Since Your Honor is so interested in legal precedent, she said, keeping it steady, let's talk about State versus Howell. That case overturned a fine like this one, because the statute behind it was too vague to hold up legally. Dalton's lips tightened. This court is not bound by Howell. Pam nodded. True, but the Supreme Court is. The room went still. Even the bailiff, who usually couldn't stay awake for a second, was now wide-eyed, tuned in. Dalton exhaled, slow and controlled. His eyes flicked to the court reporter, probably trying to remind everyone this was all being recorded. His voice was calm, but there was a crack in it, just enough to notice. Ms. Bondi, if you believe my ruling is wrong, you can appeal it. Pam smiled, but it wasn't a friendly one. That's exactly what I'm planning to do. But before we get there, let's clear something up. Dalton raised an eyebrow. Go on. Pam stepped closer to the table, palms flat on it. The statute you're using to back up this fine. How many times has it been enforced in the last 5 years? Silence. Dalton's throat moved. He knew where she was headed. Pam didn't let him off the hook. I checked before I came in today. Want to guess how many times it's been used? Dalton stayed quiet. Twice, Pam said, letting the word hit like a bomb. 2 times in 5 years. And both times? Overturned on appeal. A low murmur rolled through the gallery. Pam didn't have to turn to see it, but she felt it. People were paying attention now, in a way they hadn't before. Dalton slammed his gavel once. The details of prior cases have no bearing on the matter before this court. Pam cocked her head. Oh, but they do. Because if this fine was legit, it'd have been enforced more than twice in 5 years. But it hasn't. Every time it gets challenged, it falls apart. And here we are again. Dalton's fingers gripped the edge of his bench. He wanted to shut her down. Wanted to shut this whole thing down. But he couldn't. Not without proving her right. He took a sharp breath then, without even looking at her, flicked his hand toward the clock. Recess. 15 minutes. And just like that he stood, turned, and disappeared into his chambers. Pam didn't budge. Didn't blink. 15 minutes. Nah. This wasn't a recess. It was retreat. Dalton needed time. To think. To regroup. Maybe to figure out just how badly he'd misjudged her. Pam sat back, crossed her legs, and let out a slow breath. He could take 15 minutes. He could take an hour. Hell, he could take the whole day. It wouldn't change a damn thing. She wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Chapter 4. The Judge Strikes Back. 15 minutes passed, and when Dalton finally walked back into the courtroom, something had changed. He wasn't rattled anymore. He was collected, controlled, like a man who had just figured out exactly how he was going to win. Pam didn't like that. She straightened in her seat as he settled into his chair, adjusting his robe with slow, deliberate movements. Court is back in session, he said, his voice smooth, unreadable. Ms. Bondi, you may continue within reason. Within reason. Pam didn't miss the warning in those words. Dalton was done playing defense. Now he was setting the rules. She folded her hands on the table, calm but firm. Your Honor, I've presented clear evidence that this fine is not only unjustified but legally indefensible. And yet, instead of addressing those facts, you called a recess. Dalton gave her a cool, measured look. I called a recess because you were grandstanding. Pam smiled. Is that what we're calling due process now? A ripple of amusement spread through the gallery. But Dalton shut it down with a quick slam of his gavel. Enough. His voice had an edge to it now. Pam stayed silent. Watching. Waiting. Dalton leaned forward, just a little. You think you're exposing some grand conspiracy here, Ms. Bondi? You're not. The law is the law. And as far as this courtroom is concerned, I am the law. There it was. The mask slipping. Pam exhaled slowly. That's the problem, isn't it? Dalton's eyes narrowed. She didn't back down. You don't get to be the law, Your Honor. The law exists whether you like it or not. And right now it's not on your side. Dalton sat back, fingers steepled like he was some kind of mastermind. And yet here you are, still in my courtroom, still at my mercy. The weight of his words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Pam's pulse kicked up, but she didn't flinch. Dalton wasn't arguing anymore. He wasn't trying to fight the facts. He was trying to remind her who held the power, who held the gavel, and that for now it wasn't her. What he didn't know, Pam had never needed a gavel to win. She let the silence stretch, then leaned forward. I'm curious, Judge. If you're so confident in this ruling, why bring in a senior judge? The room shifted. Dalton didn't flinch, but Pam saw it. His fingers twitched against the bench. She'd hit a nerve. I didn't bring in anyone, he said smoothly. Judge Whitaker is simply observing the proceedings. Pam tilted her head. Right. Just a casual observer. Nothing to do with the fact that this fine is crumbling under scrutiny. Dalton's voice dropped sharp. Careful, Ms. Bondi. Pam could feel it now. Dalton wasn't just playing defense. He was setting a trap, waiting for her to push too hard, to say too much, to give him an excuse to shut her down for good. She inhaled through her nose, forcing herself to ease back. Not retreating, just recalibrating. She wasn't playing into his hands. Not now. Not when she was this close. Instead, she met his gaze head-on. I'm ready to proceed. Dalton studied her for a long moment, then nodded. Then let's continue. But the way he said it, the tone, it sent a chill up her spine. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 5, The System Fights Back. Pam barely had time to settle back into her seat before the side door creaked open. Every head in the courtroom turned as an older man in a black robe stepped inside, walking with the kind of slow, deliberate pace that practically screamed authority. Judge Whitaker. Pam's stomach tightened. Dalton had called in the cavalry. Whitaker took his seat next to Dalton, folding his hands neatly on the bench. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sharpness in his gaze, a quiet, assessing energy that made it clear he wasn't just there to observe. Dalton cleared his throat, breaking the tension. As a matter of judicial procedure, Judge Whitaker will be sitting in for the remainder of this hearing. Pam let that hang in the air for a moment. He wanted her rattled, thrown off. He wanted her to feel like the odds were stacked against her. But she didn't give him the satisfaction. Instead, she leaned back, crossing her arms. Wow. 2 judges for 1 fine. Guess I really struck a nerve. A few quiet chuckles rippled through the gallery before Dalton shot them down with a glare. Whitaker spoke for the first time, his voice even and controlled. Ms. Bondi, this isn't about striking nerves. It's about maintaining order in this courtroom. Pam met his gaze unwavering. Then I assume you'll be ensuring due process is followed? Whitaker didn't blink. That remains to be seen. A classic non-answer. Dalton straightened, his tone shifting to one of authority. Ms. Bondi, let's get to the heart of the matter. You claim this fine is unlawful, yet the statute allows for judicial discretion. Are you suggesting judges don't have the authority to impose penalties as they see fit? Pam exhaled slowly. He was twisting her argument, trying to make it look like she was challenging the very foundation of judicial power. Clever. Too bad she was ready. What I'm suggesting, she said, her voice crisp and clear, is that discretion doesn't mean unchecked power. A judge can't just decide they don't like someone and slam them with a fine out of nowhere. That's not discretion. That's abuse. Dalton's face darkened. Whitaker lifted a brow. Strong words, counselor. Pam shrugged. Strong abuse. The room was silent, the tension thickening by the second. Then Whitaker leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, studying her like she was a puzzle. You've made quite the argument, Miss Bondi. But tell me, if you're so confident in your case, why are you arguing here instead of simply filing an appeal? Pam let out a short laugh. Because you both know how this game works, don't you? Judges make bad rulings, force lawyers to waste months, sometimes years, fighting them, and by the time they're overturned, the damage is already done. Dalton's gavel slammed down. That's enough. Pam held his glare unflinching. Hit a nerve. Dalton inhaled sharply, but before he could speak, Whitaker raised a hand. That's enough for now, the senior judge said, his voice calm but firm. We'll take another recess. Pam watched as Dalton stood too quickly, his robe billowing as he stormed off. Whitaker didn't move, though. He just sat there, his eyes never leaving her, like he was waiting for something. After a long beat, he spoke again, his tone softer this time. Careful, Ms. Bondi. You might not like what happens next. Pam didn't flinch. Chapter 6, The Evidence Trap. Pam could feel it the second she walked back into the courtroom. The air had changed. The energy was colder, heavier. Dalton was back in his seat, jaw tight, fingers tapping with impatience. Whitaker sat beside him, unreadable as ever, but now there was something else in his eyes. Calculation. Pam had spent years in courtrooms. She knew a setup when she saw one. Dalton cleared his throat. Before we proceed, the court will hear testimony from Officer Reynolds, the enforcement officer who issued the initial fine. Pam tensed. So this was the play. Dalton was done arguing the law, because he was losing that battle. Now he was trying to make this about facts, about evidence. If they could create the illusion that the fine was justified, then it didn't matter how strong her legal argument was. She glanced at the gallery. The audience was hooked now, leaning in, waiting to see what would happen next. Fine. If Dalton wanted a battle, she'd give him one. The bailiff called in Reynolds, a uniformed officer in his late 50s, looking tired and stiff. He took the stand, swore in, and sat down, gripping the armrests like he was bracing for something bad. Dalton folded his hands. Officer Reynolds, please explain why this fine was issued. Reynolds cleared his throat. There was a violation. Pam cut in. What violation? Dalton shot her a glare. You'll have your chance for cross-examination, Ms. Bondi. Pam leaned back in her chair, letting Reynolds continue. There was a failure to comply with procedural regulations, the officer said, his voice steady but vague. Pam's eyes narrowed. That was deliberate, purposefully vague. She waited until he finished, then stood. Your Honor, I'd like to cross-examine the witness. Dalton hesitated, just a fraction of a second before nodding. Proceed. Pam walked to the stand, keeping her tone casual. Officer Reynolds, you mentioned a failure to comply. Can you specify exactly what wasn't complied with? Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. The standard procedural requirement. Pam nodded as though considering that. Right. In which specific procedure was violated? Reynolds' fingers twitched. Pam waited. Finally, he muttered. I'd have to check the documentation. Pam let that hang in the air, letting the silence settle. Then she turned to address the room. So just to clarify, this fine was issued, enforced, and upheld without even confirming the exact violation? Dalton stiffened. That's not what the officer said. Pam held up a hand. Then let's be precise. She turned back to Reynolds. Officer, did you personally verify that a violation occurred before issuing this fine? Reynolds swallowed. I followed standard procedure. Pam tilted her head. That's not what I asked. Silence. The room was locked in now. The tension was thick, palpable. Reynolds licked his lips. I was acting on an administrative directive. Pam's heart skipped a beat. There it was. She stepped in closer, voice low. So you were ordered to issue the fine, without verifying a violation? Reynolds hesitated. Pam leaned in slightly, her gaze piercing. Yes or no, officer? Reynolds exhaled through his nose. Yes. Boom. The gallery erupted in a chorus of whispers. Dalton slammed his gavel. Enough. Pam didn't move. Didn't blink. She turned back to Dalton, voice calm but firm. Your Honor, we now have sworn testimony that this fine was issued without proper verification. That alone makes it invalid. Dalton's face was a mask of stone, but Pam could see it. The crack forming in his composure, the shift in his eyes. She had him. And now he had to decide whether to double down or back down. Either way, she wasn't done. Not yet. Chapter 7. When the system breaks. For the first time since this whole circus started, Dalton looked unsure. Not angry. Not smug. Just stuck. Pam had him boxed in. Reynolds' testimony couldn't be brushed aside. It was on the record now. A ticking time bomb sitting right in the middle of the courtroom. And the gallery knew it. People were whispering, shifting in their seats. The court reporter's fingers hovered over the keys, ready to type at any moment. Even Whitaker, who had been silent until now, was watching Dalton, his face unreadable, but his stillness speaking volumes. Pam didn't move, didn't speak. She wanted Dalton to say something first, because whatever he said next, that was going to define everything. Dalton exhaled through his nose, slow and controlled. Then he tapped his gavel once, just once. The court, he said, his voice measured. We'll take a brief recess. Pam's pulse kicked up. Recess. She narrowed her eyes, scanning his face, his posture. This wasn't a break. This was stalling. Dalton needed time. Time to figure out a way out of this mess without admitting defeat. Pam stood, smoothing out her blazer. Your Honor, before you clear this courtroom, I'd like the record to reflect that the state has failed to provide a legal basis for this fine. Dalton's gavel slammed down. I said recess. A flicker of something dark flashed in his eyes. Pam clenched her jaw. He was rattled, yeah, but he wasn't broken. Not yet. Dalton stood abruptly and disappeared through the side door. Whitaker, however, didn't follow. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, watching Pam like a chess player studying their opponent before making the next move. Slow. Calculating. Pam turned to pack up her files when a quiet voice stopped her. Ms. Bondi. She glanced up. Whitaker was still seated, fingers interlaced, his expression unreadable. But his tone, it carried weight. You should know, he said. You've made this very difficult for yourself. Pam let out a short, humorless laugh. Oh, I'm so sorry for insisting on actual due process. Whitaker didn't react. He just kept watching her, studying her closely. Then after a beat he spoke again. You're not fighting a case anymore, he said. You're fighting the system. Pam's fingers curled around the edge of the table. I know, she replied, steady and firm. Whitaker held her gaze for a moment longer, then nodded once, like he had just confirmed something to himself. Then he stood and left the courtroom. Pam exhaled, the tension of the moment still clinging to her. The gallery was still buzzing, the whispers growing louder, everyone speculating about what was coming next. She grabbed her files and turned toward the exit, because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Chapter 8. The system blinks first. Pam walked back into the courtroom, the sound of her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. The air felt thick, charged, like everyone knew something big was about to happen, but had no idea which way it would break. Dalton was already seated stone-faced, his hands folded tightly on the bench. Whitaker was beside him, still unreadable, still watching. Pam didn't sit. She stood at the defense table waiting. Dalton exhaled through his nose, then paused, jaw clenched. Pam saw it before he even said the words. He didn't want to do this. He had to. Dalton's fingers tapped once against the bench before he finally forced the words out. Reverse the fine. A beat of silence. Then the gallery erupted. Gasps. Whispers. A ripple of disbelief. Even the court reporter looked up, her eyes wide. Pam let the moment settle before she spoke. So just to be clear, Your Honor, this fine was issued without due process, without proper verification, and is now being overturned. Dalton's glare could have cut through steel. That is the ruling. Pam nodded slowly. Good to have that on the record. Dalton's knuckles turned white against the bench. He wanted this over. Wanted her gone. But Pam wasn't done. She turned to face the room, her voice carrying through the courtroom. And for every other case where this fine was issued under the same circumstances? Dalton's face barely twitched, but the silence between them said everything. He knew what she was doing, and he hated it. Pam turned back to him, her gaze steady. How many other people were fined without proof, Your Honor? Finally, Whitaker spoke. That is beyond the scope of this hearing. Pam didn't flinch. She met his gaze directly. Not for the people who paid those fines. A flicker of something crossed Whitaker's face. Approval? Amusement? It was hard to tell, but he didn't argue. Dalton, on the other hand, looked like he was about to throw his gavel through the wall. Pam exhaled, collected her files, and smoothed out her blazer. This fight was over. But the war? That was just getting started. She turned to leave, and as she passed the bench, Whitaker spoke again quietly just for her. Watch yourself, Miss Bondi. Pam paused for just a second. Then, without looking back, she walked out of the courtroom. Because she wasn't watching her back. She was making sure they had to watch theirs. The day a judge lost control, Pam Bondi walked into that courtroom thinking it was just another day. Instead, she got blindsided with a $10,000 fine. No explanation. No due process, just raw, unchecked power. But the system underestimated her. She tore apart their arguments, exposed the corruption, and backed a judge into a corner so tight, he had no choice but to fold. The fine? Overturned. The courtroom? Shaken. The system? Exposed. But make no mistake, this wasn't a win. This was a warning. Because when Pam walked out of that courthouse, she knew one thing for sure. They weren't done with her. And she sure as hell wasn't done with them. If you want more stories where the system gets pushed to its breaking point, hit that subscribe button, smash that like, and turn on notifications. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.